Welcome to the Filmlinks Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm not Alex.
And this is episode 91, Quintessential Quentin.
Alex isn't here.
Alex isn't here. Schedules didn't really line up for this one, so.
I don't know whether or not I should be flattered or insulted.
Yeah, so who are you, not Alex?
Well, I have been on the podcast a few times. People might know me as Hayden Chauffe.
Yes, Hayden is back, and we are in the same room today. Super excited to talk to you.
Yes.
You have been on to talk about a range of things, from Miyazaki to Jim Henson to now Quentin Tarantino, who is like diametrically opposed to both of those other content creators.
We are talking about something very, very different than Jim Henson and Miyazaki today.
Oh yeah. So yeah, but this is a director that you're very passionate about. You like Quentin Tarantino. So just give me like a little bit of backstory. Like, when did you kind of become aware of Quentin Tarantino, and what about his movies sticks out to you as far as him as a director?
Right. So the first time that I was exposed to Quentin Tarantino was actually through my brother, who in middle school, he was very much into samurais and katanas and like swordplay and things like that. So he was a big fan of Kill Bill.
Okay, yeah. It's a good place to start.
Yes. So just him really enjoying that movie was how I got exposed to Quentin Tarantino. And after that, I think the next movie I watched was actually once I was out of high school. And that was Pulp Fiction. And I just remember just watching that for the first time, just the way that Tarantino handles suspense. I was like absolutely on the edge of my seat the entire time, and how his dialogue kind of fuels into the story and kind of creates this like really believable and naturalistic world where you're getting fed all this exposition, but you don't realize it.
Yeah. We definitely got to talk about the dialogue.
Yeah. It's just like, I think the thing that makes Tarantino so wonderful and unique is definitely definitely his technique. I know there's a lot of controversial things that Tarantino does that maybe cause people to steer away from him, but I think fundamentally, like, the technique that he incorporates is definitely worth at least studying.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's a director that knows movies. And so for people like us and hopefully our listeners too, you know, the range of films that we cover on the podcast, from like European cinema to old classics to silent films, like Quentin Tarantino grew up with a lot of that stuff, and a lot of that feeds into him as a filmmaker. So on that note, let's kind of talk about his background. Quentin Tarantino was born in 1963 in Knoxville, Tennessee. His father was an actor and producer, and he was actually named for Quint Asper, which was Burt Reynolds' character on Gunsmoke, which is actually hilarious because of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which pulls a lot of influences from television westerns like Gunsmoke.
Yeah, his parents had essentially planned him to be just a complete Western nut from day one.
Yeah. And we will be talking about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but in the bonus podcast on Patreon, and stick around at the end to hear more details about that.
Definitely an interesting film.
Yeah, absolutely. And brand new. So lots of hot takes going around right now. So when he was 3 years old, he moved to LA permanently, and his mom was pretty lax about what kinds of movies he was able to watch. So he was exposed to all different types of movies and ratings and stuff like that from a very young age.
She had a very laissez-faire attitude about exposing him to all these movies.
Which makes sense why there's so much kind of adult content in his films. And in his teenage years, he wrote a screenplay based on Smokey and the Bandit at 14. He did community theater. He actually dropped out of high school at 15 and started working in video stores.
And the big one was the Video Village, where that was probably his first big exposure to kind of like laying out his opinions and like ideas on films and like
and just getting exposed to more kind of under the radar films or foreign films and stuff like that you don't normally see in the big screen theaters.
Yeah, but in interviews he talks about how he would have a shelf behind him and he would kind of put together different collections. Like he would put together a Western collection, or he would put together like a thriller collection, and he would basically try to persuade people coming into the Video Village to try out these different films.
That's interesting, because that's kind of what the Criterion Channel does on their streaming site is every week or every month they put together a different like grouping of films and kind of some little explanation of why the films fit together. Like one that I watched recently, they put together Last Hurrah for Chivalry, which is an old wuxia film from Taiwan, and a French musical called The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. And you're like, how do these two movies go together? And they kind of explain it. So that's interesting that Quentin Tarantino was doing that kind of film curating from such an early age.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, he wrote From Dusk Till Dawn for Robert Rodriguez in the early 90s. And after that, a little bit more collaboration with Robert Rodriguez. And then he writes his own film, Reservoir Dogs, which we will be talking about today, which comes out in 1992, screens at Sundance, and is immediately like a huge hit. The way that the dialogue was handled, the way that the violence was handled, the way that it kind of incorporates noir elements and stuff like that was a big deal, and people really took notice really early on.
Yeah, that was definitely the one that put him on the map. And just it kind of we kind of start to see the gears turn from the kind of style that he has, which is more of a literary style than necessarily the kind of films that they were doing currently in the 90s, which were very linear, very
his films are
soapy, I guess is the right word.
I think all of Tarantino's films are non-linear to some extent or other, where he's cutting time, he's putting things out of order and making us kind of fill in the gaps as we go along. So then he gets a couple more writing jobs. He wrote Natural Born Killers and True Romance, and was offered other projects that I didn't know this until researching, but he was offered Speed. Apparently he was offered Men in Black.
Boy, that would have been a very different movie.
That would have been a very, very different movie. So he was kind of on the scene, but turned down some of those projects and apparently retreated a little bit and wrote Pulp Fiction, which again became a huge hit, obviously a cult classic at this point. And the interesting thing about Tarantino, which the future will still have to tell if this pans out or not, but he claims that he'll only make 10 films. I think this doesn't include Death Proof, or does that count?
I think he does count Death Proof.
Okay.
But now there's a debate up in the air because there's talks of him doing the next Star Trek film.
Yeah, I did hear that.
And people are discussing whether or not, okay, does that count as his 10th?
Because, so here's the deal. The Hateful Eight, which is another film we talked about today, is his 8th film. You know, that kind of all ties together. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is billed as his 9th film.
Correct.
He's already announced Kill Bill Volume 3, which is another interesting thing because I think he considers Kill Bill to be one story. I think he considers them 2 movies in his little 10 movie thing. But you're right. If that would be interesting because he's already slated for Kill Bill and he's in serious talks for Star Trek. But to my understanding, he's talked about, once he does 10 films, he's going to stop. He's going to start directing theater and writing novels and stuff like that. And his love of novels is something that's really interesting as far as the way that he directs, because obviously every director has to love storytelling in lots of different formats that almost always includes books and novels and stuff. But Tarantino takes it to this point where this novel structure works its way into each of his films in some form or another. So we'll have to talk about that.
Absolutely.
So we'll see how many films he ends up doing, but he's getting up to his 10th already. So we'll see. But Hayden, and you picked all of these out, so I'll let you kind of introduce them for us. What films are we going to be talking about today? And tell me why they're on this list, too. We don't do that enough.
All right. So first up to bat, we have Reservoir Dogs. Although there aren't any bats in this. I probably should have saved that for Inglourious Basterds.
Yeah, seriously.
So this was the first film that he wrote and directed.
We usually like to start with directors' kind of first big movie, so this is a good one.
Yeah, when kind of deciding this, I debated between whether or not we should do Reservoir Dogs or Pulp Fiction, since Pulp Fiction is definitely the more well-known and kind of celebrated of the two films. But I think there's a lot in Reservoir Dogs where we kind of get an understanding of how Quentin Tarantino started out. And also, there are just a lot of great scenes in Reservoir Dogs that I don't get enough attention.
Yeah.
That I don't think get enough attention. Particularly, my favorite scene in that is the commode scene, for sure. And we'll definitely talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. Moving on. What's next?
So next up to bat is...
This one. There you go.
Yes. Is Inglourious Basterds, which Quentin Tarantino considers the film that he will be known for.
Which is very interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that most people regard Pulp Fiction as his masterpiece.
Correct. But I think nowadays, like, everyone has their favorite Tarantino, and it's kind of a mixed bag. But I think Pulp Fiction, you're right, is still kind of like the one that was like, when it came out, it was a complete game changer.
Yeah.
But the thing about this film is just every scene is just an absolute like lesson in how to write suspenseful and interesting scenes.
Tension.
How to develop interesting characters. It's just an incredibly powerful film. It's very Tarantino, but even with, the violence and all the other kind of controversial stuff, it's just at its core, it's a very just beautifully done script.
Yeah. And it's fun too. Like, once you know what it is, it's a fun movie, which is kind of the irony in a lot of Tarantino movies. But as far as like awards, when it came out, this film won Best Supporting Actor for Christoph Waltz at the Oscars. I flipping love Christoph Waltz. In general.
He was my favorite actor for a while.
Oh,
just
really?
from this movie, just because I didn't realize like a villain could be that like menacing. And he's also, it's strange because like the way the script presents itself, he's the villain, but he's also kind of a protagonist as well. Yeah,
in a sense.
So
yeah, I think I was introduced to Christoph Waltz through Django Unchained, which we've already covered on the podcast, which I saw before Inglourious, and I just love him in Django, and of course he does great in Inglourious too. And the film was also nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Sound Editing. So it got
quite a handful.
It was nominated for all those, but still, it got some attention for sure. And what is the last film, Hayden, that we'll be talking about?
Yes. So the last film is that wonderful 70 millimeter
glorious 70 millimeter.
Thank you. Glorious 70 millimeter tribute to going to see the movies, The Hateful Eight, which kind of in a way mirrors Reservoir Dogs. But this at the time, this was his most recent film that he had put out.
Until like 3 weeks ago.
Correct.
as of recording this.
And there's a lot of things that Quentin Tarantino does different in this film that I think is worth exploring. And I think it gives us a very clear picture because the comparisons and the differences between this and Reservoir Dogs, I think, can really give us a clear picture of how he has grown as a director over the past 20 years.
Absolutely. And as far as awards, again, this won Best Original Score by Ennio Morricone, who is great. If you are not familiar with Ennio Morricone, he also did the score for some of the classic spaghetti westerns, such as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, one of my favorite movies. And it was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Jennifer Jason Leigh and Best Cinematography. So, yeah, with all of that being said... Thank you, Hayden, for justifying your picks. I'm very excited to talk about all of these. Yes. But let's have Jason set up Chapter 1 for us, Reservoir Dogs.
Reservoir Dogs from 1992. A crew led by mob boss Joe Cabot and his son eat breakfast before they and their crew, all with code names, perform a large-scale heist. The heist does not go well, and in the fallout, Mr. Blonde, Mr. Blue, Mr. Brown, Mr. Orange, Mr. Pink, and Mr. White are left scrambling, each with their own motives. Some try to take the money and run. Some try to figure out who the rat was who screwed up the job. Tensions run high in this crime thriller that marks the start of Tarantino's 10-film run.
All right, Hayden. So I'm just going to let you kind of take it away and tell me things that you like about Reservoir Dogs, what you think it brings to the table in terms of Quentin Tarantino films, and what you think people miss about it that it's got going for it.
Man, the thing that I enjoy so much about Reservoir Dogs is it's really the kind of this study between kind of the duality between these criminals who we have, at the time, we have a very clear picture of, okay, we have an idea of what like a thief is and like kind of organized crime and these types of people that go in and like will steal diamonds.
Yeah.
And it kind of studies the duality between like their criminal personas versus like their human identities. And I think that's the thing that Reservoir Dogs sets out to do, is it basically tell you, hey, these people may be criminals, but they're also human.
Mm-hmm. And then
well.
The first scene in the diner sets that up really well.
It does.
Because it's what, like 10 minutes of just like inane talk about tipping and stuff like that?
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, they're talking about...
maybe not 10 minutes, but still, it's just a normal conversation.
Yeah, and it does... And the interesting thing about Reservoir Dogs is it kind of tricks you at the beginning to think that it's going to be about all the Reservoir Dogs, but really it's only about 3, maybe 4.
Yeah. There are a couple that just that show up for like 2 flashback scenes and never show up again. Like Quentin Tarantino aside, one thing we should say about Quentin Tarantino is he does have a cameo in pretty much every one of his movies. Is there one that doesn't have a cameo?
You know what? I think I did spot him in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. In
you know what I was wondering? Because I couldn't see him visually. I might have just missed him. It was a long movie. But I was wondering if he did the voiceover for that, like he did for Hateful Eight.
I think it is.
Was it someone else?
Oh, he's one of Tarantino's biggest actors. I know this.
But it wasn't someone in the film, I don't think.
He was in the film.
Oh, okay. Well, we're not talking about Once Upon a Time. So basically, Kurt Russell. Okay, yeah. So Tarantino does a lot of cameos. He's one of the Reservoir Dogs. He even gets like a little title thing at the beginning. And so he gets killed off, and then a couple of the other ones do too. I think all these movies are going to have spoilers to some extent. We'll try and save some of the big ending spoilers, but that's pretty early in this movie. But yeah, there's a couple that just never show up again, and then you're right, it really focuses in on
Mr. Blue. No one knows who Mr. Blue is.
Yeah, just some old guy. And then so we focused though on Harvey Keitel, who is Mr. White.
Yes.
Steve Buscemi, who's Mr. Pink.
Yeah, and Tim Roth.
Who's Mr. Orange.
Correct.
And kind of
Michael Madsen's character, Mr. Blonde.
Mr. Blonde.
Complete psychopath.
Complete psychopath.
And it's interesting because Quentin Tarantino does such an interesting job of creating these little excerpts where we kind of get a chance to explore each of those 4 characters individually, and
kind of in a chapter E format, not as explicit as he does later on, because it's still pretty early. So I don't know if he has. I mean, he takes a lot of liberties with his directorial command, but I think just like coming out with a chapter structure like he does later on, he kind of has to build his credentials up to that.
Yeah, and we get such a clear presentation of how different they are in different settings. Particularly, I would say, I mean, obviously Tim Roth's character. Do we dive into spoilers? No?
Let's hold off on that one for a little bit.
Yeah, definitely Tim Roth's character. Definitely Michael Madsen's character as well, who seems like a normal guy in his scene, in his little separate scene.
Flashback,
Then he gets plenty of chances to prove that he is actually a complete sociopath.
In the most famous and oft parodied scene of this movie, there's a parody of that scene in Bob's Burgers of all places, which is hilarious.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the one from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Oh gosh, I'm sure. Yeah. I don't know it specifically, but so yeah, there's this film definitely has ripples in lots of other stuff. Okay, so what's your favorite part of this movie?
So I would say, and this kind of ties back to Quentin Tarantino's earlier years when he's working at the Video Village, but also studying theater and...
especially theater, because this is a contained movie. It mostly takes place in one warehouse.
It does, which is also something that they do in Hateful Eight, which we can talk about later. But he was studying as an actor, and there's one scene, the commode scene, which is, you can absolutely tell that he just ripped from acting class.
Yeah, right.
But the wonderful thing about this scene is there's such a wonderful technique that takes place where...
Describe the scene a little bit, just to set it up real quick.
Yes, that is a good... I was about to dive into it, and you guys have no idea.
Just for those who may not have seen it. Okay, I'm just going to lay down the spoiler warning here because, I mean, we can't go too deep into this movie without getting into spoilers. So if you would like to watch this movie, it's not on Netflix right now, but... I would say pause this or skip ahead to the Inglourious chapter. But from now on, we're just going to kind of talk about the end and all of, because there's a lot of twists and turns in all of these movies, but definitely Reservoir Dogs.
So probably the most important thing to know is Tim Roth's character is a cop, and
he's a mole. Yeah.
Yes. And he needs to memorize this monologue in order to convince the I guess you would call him a kingpin, Joe.
Yeah. He kind of looks like Kingpin too. This big old bald guy.
Yeah. So he's like the guy in charge, that he is good to be a part of the robbery. And so basically the monologue details this entire scene where he's basically doing a drug deal and he almost gets caught by some cops. And how Quentin Tarantino presents the scene is he starts off with Tim Roth's character kind of walking around his apartment, kind of going over the lines. And as the monologue continues, we see him presenting it to his police partner. And then we see him presenting it to Joe and some of the other criminals. And then we see him actually, like, in the scene presenting it. And then what's one of the really wonderful things that happens is about the scene is his cop partner tells him that one of the most important things about the scene is memorizing the details. So the scene kind of like, it almost kind of transforms into...
It's kind of, it's like a fantasy sequence of what's in his head while he's trying, because it didn't actually happen, but we're seeing it in the way that Tim Roth sees it in his head while he's telling it, right?
Yes. And we actually get a chance to see like the police within the scene who almost bust him have a conversation of their own, and it kind of mirrors the situation that he's in, which is, I think, is kind of a funny, ironic thing to do, because obviously it kind of A, presents his own internal concerns, but B, kind of creates the details of the world that make the whole thing feel even more real. So it's like, as an actor myself, I go back to that scene and I think, man, I just need to focus more on the details.
Yeah.
And it's all about just...
You got to know the color of the wallpaper. You got to know how many people were in there. You got to know, just being able to visualize it. And we should also talk about the structure of the movie, because this is going to be really important. We've already kind of talked about it a little bit, but basically it starts with this diner scene of a group of guys talking about, tipping and waitresses and how much they make and all this kind of stuff that really has nothing to do with anything, except it gets all the characters' voices out there really early. And then we smack dab cut to, after a couple of credits, Tim Roth's character bleeding out all over the back of this car, with Harvey Keitel driving him to this warehouse. And so all of a sudden we're like, what is going on?
Yes.
And we slowly piece together that there was this robbery, and we never see the robbery, which is great because this is Tarantino's first film. It's low budget. You can tell it's pretty low budget. He still has a decent amount of locations. He's got like the bars and the Joe's office and stuff like that. But
very theatrical.
It's very theatrical because it takes place mostly in this warehouse, and then we just hear about what happened in the robbery, but we never actually see this jewel heist that was supposed to have gone down.
Yes, it is a heist film without the heist.
Yeah, exactly. Because we've seen heist films before. We know how the heists go, and then we just put together the pieces of the cops showing up and all of this stuff, and we get a little bit like when Harvey Keitel and Tim Roth go and steal the lady's car, and Tim Roth gets shot and all that kind of stuff in the most depressingly ironic twist, where Tim Roth is the mole and he's trying to get all these guys captured, and he ends up being the only one that gets shot from this old lady in a car, where you expect the danger comes from the other criminals that he's with and deceiving, but he gets the most pathetic kind of wound that he's got to deal with for the whole
Tarantino
movie.
Loves his irony.
Yeah.
And I think one of the wonderful things about all of that is the fact that I think Tarantino is trying to tell us, sure, this is a heist film, but the most important, and I wouldn't say important, let me correct myself, the most interesting things that happen in a heist film are the aftermath and the planning. And how that affects each of the characters, and I think that's kind of the theme that we'll see throughout Tarantino's work, is that it's not so much about the robbery or whatever the robbery may be. It's more about the characters themselves, people, and the human. And I mean, that's like this movie 101.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking when I watched the movie. Like, there's really not that much that happens that we actually see. There's the torture scene, and there's the flashbacks, which are kind of plot-y, but most of it is just people talking. They're just kind of talking, and their personalities are clashing. And that's why Quentin Tarantino has become known as the king of dialogue, because all of his movies, and we're going to see this a lot in Inglourious, they just take their time with people talking, and we're building suspense, we're building intrigue, we're building character arcs all through dialogue, and the way that that's able to be very natural, which another thing that Tarantino is pretty well known for is just that introduces a lot of like bad language into the language, especially when you're dealing with criminals and really rough characters, which most of his films do. And the other thing is, aside from the dialogue and stuff, Tarantino is really well known for his violence and his gore. And this film is less excessive than most, maybe because of that smaller scale. But still, when it comes out and you see that the second scene, the very first shot, smash cut of Tim Roth with blood everywhere. That was a big wake up call for people at this point. And we just Alex and I just talked about like the American New Wave and Bonnie and Clyde and some of these movies that introduced a lot more violence because now all of a sudden they could once the Hays Code fell apart. And Tarantino is coming in this tradition of seeing those boundaries get broken down systematically through the 70s. And then I guess kind of plateaued a little bit in the 80s. And so then he kind of breathes new life into this angle of crime and violence by adding a little bit more of that character development and humanity to it in a really ironic way, because a lot of his movies are very excessively gory. I don't think I'm understating it when I say that.
Not at
or
all.
Overstating it, rather.
And it's interesting because I think he's making kind of kind of having that contrast between these really human scenes versus kind of these over-the-top, really extreme, intense scenes where you kind of get almost this commentary on, film as a whole. He's kind of analyzing how society has kind of devolved into this more, sex and violence culture, especially in our media. So it's interesting, like, you could argue the opposite, like maybe he's kind of playing along with it, but it's also, I think, definitely...
Like presenting it in an ironic way.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to imagine he has fun with it. You can't watch Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained and not, like, even if it is to some extent a commentary, like Tarantino just likes his blood and squibs and gore and all that.
Yeah, but I think there's definitely, especially in Inglourious, there's a very much an underlined commentary on the gore.
Yeah.
So
on a technical level, there's a couple of things that I wanted to bring up, which in this movie is a little more noticeable. There's a lot of really long takes, which is easy to do in a bottle film where you're in a warehouse and you're just watching people kind of interact. And so if your actors know the scene, you can just kind of put the camera on them and let them play it out like theater, like the scene where Keitel and Buscemi are talking at the very beginning. I think a lot of that in the little pink kitchen area is played for a long time. And of course, the razor blade scene, I think, plays out, maybe not the whole scene, but a lot of it of him just dancing around with the razor plays out in one take.
Yeah, he loves... Yeah, there are a lot of wides where he'll just, like, let the camera hang back. Yeah. And he'll use that to his advantage, too. Like in the razor blade scene, he kind of, like... he'll keep it in the wide, but then he'll cut, like, immediately to that close-up of Tim Roth once he responds.
Yeah.
So just great filmmaking in general.
And the other thing that I didn't realize started all the way back in Reservoir Dogs, but I think I saw one of these shots in Reservoir Dogs. This is going to get really technical for a second.
I'm ready.
Tarantino loves split diopter shots. Do you know what that means?
I have no idea what that means.
Okay, that's like a really technical camera thing, but basically it's a thing you can add to your lens which allows you to set two different planes of focus. So he'll do something where there's someone very close to the lens and someone very far away from the lens. And usually you have to pick one of them to be in focus and you have to rack your focus back and forth. But a split diopter lets you set one area that's close to the camera in focus and an area far away from the camera in focus. And he uses that in, I think... I can't remember a specific one from Django, but at least in all three of these movies, he uses it a lot in the Hateful Eight.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Where you've got something really close to the camera and something really far away from the camera that are both in focus, not because it's deep focus, but just because he has split his focus plane.
The one that comes to mind in Hateful Eight is the pouring of the poison into the coffee.
Yeah. And there's some stuff at the end that I won't get into right now, but
spoilers again.
Yeah, so Tarantino loves his really technical stuff, and again, being kind of this student of film, there's some stuff in Inglourious Basterds that is very Hitchcockian. I was picking up a lot of Hitchcock vibes in Inglourious that I don't remember from the first time that I watched it. I mean, a lot of that you're seeing in Reservoir Dogs, but Reservoir Dogs has, just compared to where he's come now, it definitely has a little bit of a cruder aspect, a little rough around the edges, but you can definitely see where those rough edges get smoothed out over his career with every movie. He takes these techniques and kind of polishes them as we go along.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think we can dive a little bit into how he utilizes music. So the big story with the music in Tarantino's work, obviously the radio that plays throughout Reservoir Dogs kind of becomes a character of its own.
Almost acts as a narrator. Because most of Tarantino's films do have a narrator, but I don't think this one does have an explicit narrator. But you're right, the radio does serve to be kind of a narrator, and it introduces the pop music, which is something that Tarantino has become very well known for. But it's interesting that I think he might in this movie, but in a lot of like his period pieces, he will still use the pop music, which is something that typically bothers me, but Tarantino has a way of pulling it off a lot of times. Like in period pieces, I usually want like a score or something that feels more time period, but like the rap music in Django just works for some reason. And it's because also he doesn't usually, for some of his modern films like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, he will use pop music almost exclusively, but he does incorporate a score, and he kind of knows when to use the pop music and when to use more traditional film music. Yeah,
I mean, and I think the first thing that he finally caved in and did an actual score for, I know he did some of it for Kill Bill, and then also Hateful Eight actually had
Hateful Eight, definitely, yeah. And I think score. Inglourious was mostly pop music and classical music, so I don't know if it had like a custom score for it.
But the interesting thing about using the pop music, it actually evolved out of necessity, because he realized that, at the time he was a kind of a new director, and getting someone to actually compose a score was very expensive. So he realized, here's a solution. I can just license out all this music.
Which is interesting, because usually you think of licensing as being really expensive, but I never really thought about how that compares to the cost of actually getting a composer and an orchestra and all of that. So I guess licensing would be cheaper, even though I usually think of licensing as being really expensive.
Yeah. I think he got a deal too.
Okay.
The one song that he needed to get into his film, I remember, was the in the razor scene, Stuck in the Middle with You.
Yeah.
And
which has become an integral part of that scene.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of Reservoir Dogs, that's just, and that scene in particular, it's just like,
that song has to be there.
That's as iconic as you can be. So yeah, I mean, and Tarantino in the past has stated he's as proud of his soundtrack selection as he is of his actual films.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, he's a very meticulous kind of director. I've heard like a couple anecdotes about how he likes to keep it fun on set and stuff like that, but I also feel like I haven't done too much digging into like interviews about his process or anything, but I feel like he would almost have a Kubrickian kind of OCD about the way that his shots come out and all that kind of stuff.
And music plays a huge role in that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so Jason, let's move into chapter 2 of this podcast.
Inglourious Basterds from 2009. It's World War II, and an elite force of Jewish American men have been recruited to a unit known as the Bastards to hunt down and spread fear among the most vicious and vile Nazis out there. Led by Lieutenant Aldo Rain, the unit features the likes of the Bear Jew and Sergeant Hugo Stiglitz, a rogue German soldier who turned on the Gestapo and has taken a liking to murdering them. Word of the Bastards even spreads to Hitler himself, including their trademark carving of a swastika into the foreheads of any Nazis they leave alive. Meanwhile, Shoshana, a secretly Jewish woman in occupied France whose family has been murdered by Nazis, runs a theater in Paris. There, a Nazi war hero and the star of a new propaganda film, Zoller, becomes obsessed with Shoshana and convinces Goebbels to hold a premiere at the theater, inviting Hitler himself as well. Soon, the bastards discover this information and set to work on a plot to assassinate their Führer at the film premiere. And with Shoshana seeing a similar opportunity, the stage is set for an explosive ending.
All right, Hayden, so you've told me that this is probably your favorite Tarantino film, is that right?
That is correct.
All right, so I'm not even going to bother with spoilers. This is just going to be spoilers. Inglourious is on Netflix as of the recording of this, so if you would like to watch it, go do that, because we're just
Please
going to
do.
talk about it. And there are spoilers, but we have to talk about them. But tell me why you like this movie. What puts it at the top of your Tarantino list? Christoph Waltz, obviously.
Yes. And really just all around tremendous performances from the entire cast. I mean, Brad Pitt as the
Oh my gosh, he's
as Aldo,
hilarious.
the Apache, he's phenomenal. And another interesting thing about this film is it's actually can be considered a foreign film because he has each of the characters speaking their actual language. So French people speak French, German people speak German. Mm-hmm. So it creates kind of this really wonderful, like almost like cultural experience. And obviously with this film, we're diving into World War II and kind of this fusion of like cultures like at odds with each other.
Yeah.
In
I
a
guess
very
to pull out a little bit of film nerdy stuff with whenever the soldier meets the girl at the movie theater. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting all of their character names right now.
So Shoshana.
Yeah,
and,
Shoshana.
I know this. Frederick. Zoller.
Yeah. So when they meet and he's like, so what are you showing? And she's talking about all the different European film directors. He's like kind of flexing his muscles on 40s. I mean, it's just kind of fact about what would be out. But at this point, they're really film buffy movies and directors with all the French and German name drops from the 40s.
Yeah, and you can always rely on that from Tarantino. And yeah, this kind of, at the time, kind of encompassed some of the best things about Tarantino, but also introduced kind of a new style that he was starting to explore. So we definitely have kind of the overlapping plots. We have three primary protagonists in this. We have the Inglourious Basterds themselves, led by Brad Pitt's character. Mm-hmm. We have the incredible villainous Nazi detective played by Christoph Waltz. And then we have Shoshana, who in the first scene of the film, which is one of the most incredible openings that you'll ever find in any film anywhere, where just the suspense and the use of shot work and film technique just kind of elevates the story to an 11.
We actually studied that scene on its own in one of my film school classes. Before I'd actually seen the whole movie, we studied that one scene just like as an example of building tension and stuff like that. It's really incredible.
Yeah, we could probably talk about that scene all day.
I do. I kind of want to break it down. So yeah, this is the first scene. So I'm just going to kind of go through the whole thing, because what happens is Christoph Waltz drives up to this dairy farm. First of all, the music is really epic, kind of classical
play,
music that sets the tension already. We know something's going on, but all we see is this dairy farmer and his daughters, and he's telling them to go clean up. And then the Nazis come in, and Christoph Waltz is being so polite, and he starts playing. You kind of get the feeling that he's playing a mind game with him, but everything seems so nonchalant. He's like, this is just routine. We're just going over things. He starts talking in English, which just seems like a natural thing, because he explains it off as like, I don't know French that well, so let's talk in English because we both know English.
So many detective techniques going on. It's crazy.
But the thing is, and this is kind of the beginning of where I want to start bringing in Hitchcock parallels to this movie, because there's a lot of them, is back when we did our long Hitchcock series, we brought up one of Hitchcock's most famous maxims, which is, you can film a 5-minute scene of two people talking about baseball, and it'd be a really boring scene, and then at the end of those 5 minutes, the table explodes, and you get your shock value of like this explosion that happens that you didn't expect. But if you show the bomb to the audience at the beginning of the scene, then the conversation about baseball becomes more interesting because you are wondering at what point is that bomb going to explode. And that's what Tarantino does in this movie over and over and over again, because in the middle of the scene, which we think is pretty innocuous, we may have some suspicions, we pan down under the floorboards and we see a family of Jews that are hiding from the Nazis under there. And so then now we know there's a bomb under the table, and we're wondering if the Nazis are going to find out, because Christoph Waltz seems very confident in himself and his abilities. But at the beginning of the scene, we don't know if the farmer is actually hiding Jews or not. We just think it might be kind of a routine thing. And so once we do know that, the whole scene flips on its head until the point where Christoph Waltz directly accuses him of hiding the Jews, and he admits to it in a really, really emotional climax. This whole scene is almost a short film in itself. It has a beginning, middle, and end, and a character arc for this farmer guy, and then it ends with this massacre, basically, out of which Shoshana escapes. But the scene itself is just brilliantly constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like all the nuance that happens within the scene. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the switching between languages, which is kind of this disorienting effect.
Yeah.
But, him kind of like asking from the milk, kind of like invading the home, kind of, asking all these questions like he's a polite guest, when obviously we know the connotation of being kind of a Nazi detective. He can get whatever he wants, and having that power over the dairy farmer. It almost becomes condescending when he asks for it.
He does it in a very polite way, but you're right, kind of just knowing his position, he knows he could just walk in and take it. And he's totally planning to, once he finds out that there's Jews there, he's planning to just do whatever he wants without asking. But the way that he kind of comes in with this kind of, in a weird way, it's like an arrogant false humility that plays off. It's really hard to describe, but Christoph Waltz pulls it off really, really well.
Yeah, and of course there's that wonderful moment where he pulls out the Sherlock Holmes pipe.
Yeah, because the farmer's been smoking this like normal pipe, and then he's like, "Do you mind if I smoke?" And he pulls out this gigantic pipe, which is like a commentary in itself on this kind of like overcompensation on the part of the Germans and the power play. There are lots of power dynamics in this movie.
Yeah, there are just so many like wonderful moments of minutia going on in the scene that just completely inform the audience. Like, we know exactly who these characters are by the end of the scene, even though like you could argue there's an entirely different scene going on the surface, but the way he implements the details below the surface, I mean, no pun intended with
with the Jews
family,
under the floorboard.
It just creates for just some of the most wonderful storytelling in cinema.
And the other thing that it does, not that he needs to, but it really this is going to sound really stupid when I say it, but it villainizes the Nazis. Okay.
Yes.
Like, you don't need to villainize Nazis, but by starting the film off with a massacre scene, which is probably not far off from real life, what it does is it gets us emotionally prepared for the Bastards scene, which comes almost directly after this scene, I think. And once we're introduced to the Bastards, which their entire storyline is about this kind of diabolical, and yet what Quentin Tarantino does is basically justifies this enjoyment of murder of the Nazis in the way that the Nazis have this enjoyment of killing the Jews. But by showing us the Nazis killing the Jews first for no reason, it then sets us up to have fun with the Bastards, who take this really weird kind of, I want to say objectively, but in normal circumstances, this grotesque enjoyment of killing the Nazis, but you don't feel bad about it because of what the Nazis are, and the fact that you were reminded about it in the first scene. You can't start this movie with the Bastards and not have this like tinge of guilt by enjoying them without showing the evilness of the Nazis at the beginning. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And he plays that up even further with Brad Pitt's character too, who is just as American, like deep South as you can possibly get.
Yeah. What did it say? He's from like Tennessee or Kentucky or something like that?
I think so. Yeah. Whatever he did, I think he made moonshine. Has a scene where he talks about that. But yeah, and there is that wonderful dynamic between the fact that like kind of it's Christoph Waltz's character versus Brad Pitt character in a sense, and the fact that they're the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. They don't really encounter each other till the very end, but
they're both forces to be reckoned with.
Yes.
On their respective sides of the war.
Absolutely. They're very much larger than life characters that, in Christoph Waltz's case, like you just want to see him, get justice for all the evils he's committed.
Yeah.
And then Brad Pitt's character, even though, he's out there, killing Nazis, essentially. You absolutely love to see what will happen next with his character.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that Tarantino does really well as far as setting up the Bastards is showing because what he has to kind of do is in a short amount of time set up this mythology around the Bastards. Because if you watch the first scene of Brad Pitt doing his whole "we're gonna be killing Nazis" monologue, and I need 100 Nazi scalps from each one of you, it's kind of ridiculous. And Brad Pitt, as this kind of Southern guy, almost feels like a joke. And so in order to actually build them up, you have the scene that follows of Hitler getting this news about the quote-unquote bear Jew and how they've been terrorizing all the Nazis and all the things that they've been doing, like smashing their heads in with bats and like creating this mythology that has worked its way all the way up to Hitler. And so now we're like, okay, the Bastards actually are this force to be reckoned with. Because I remember the first time that I watched it, I was like, there's no, like, these guys are going to go out there and they're just going to like lose because they're a bunch of hicks basically going out trying to kill Nazis, but they don't know what they're doing in war. And then you're like, oh, maybe they do. And they're really good at it. So that kind of gives them some credibility. I think most of the time before we get to Michael Fassbender's bit is setting up the Bastards and setting up Christoph Waltz. And then they have a little bit of the Shoshana stuff in there too. But when we get to Michael Fassbender and leading up to the climax, we realize that the Bastards are a force to be reckoned with, and they're not just a bunch of hillbillies that don't know what they're doing.
And if we can, I just want to kind of touch on the idea that you're talking about of the mythology, because that's another thing that's really explored in this film is the whole idea of the duality, and we're jumping back to duality between who these characters are and kind of like the mythology that they've created for themselves, right? So we have Christoph Waltz's character who becomes known as the Jew Hunter, and like so much of the first scene is about the fear that's been created from the stories that have been told about his character.
Yeah.
And Brad Pitt in the Bastards kind of do the exact same thing with their resistance amongst like basically, like, I mean, they all get nicknames, and like they basically look at the Bastards as like these sprites that
they literally
can't be
call
caught.
them like golems, basically.
Apparitions. And it's a really interesting thing to explore, kind of like how stories can kind of elevate people to kind of this level of like intensity and mythology that isn't actually possible in real life.
Right. And the way that they lean into it, because you kind of get the sense that the Bastards set out to create this mythology about themselves when Brad Pitt in his opening monologues, like, and the Nazi will fear us and they will hate us, or whatever he says about them. Christoph Waltz sets it up like someone else gave him the name and he just likes it because he feels like it's true. So there's that dichotomy of like whether you are able to set up your own image in other people's minds, or if that's just something that is conferred upon you and what you do with that. Because, I mean, to some extent, that's kind of the story of Hitler, right? Like, he told this story about himself and got a lot of people to go along with it. And it had terrible, terrible consequences. So...
yeah, and that's even explored, getting back to the movie even further with Shoshana and Frederick's characters, with Frederick, who's this famous Nazi soldier amongst the Germans.
War hero, as they call him.
And basically how he stood in a bird's nest and like killed a tremendous amount of people, and how the German cinema... I forget the name of the head of the German cinema.
Joseph Goebbels, who was actually Hitler's right-hand man, and he plays a big part in this movie.
And how they want to, in order to rally up the Nazis, basically create this film called Nation's Pride about the exploits of Frederick.
Which is not a real movie, but it's something that you could totally see coming out of German cinema of the era, like... the film commission that created Triumph of the Will could totally make something called Nation's Pride about this soldier who just like literally was shooting fish in a barrel, but is like shooting the Allies with
just essentially just a lot of war propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely like a lot of different storylines that all converge at the end. And one of the things that I found really interesting, so the first time that I watched this, I didn't totally have any expectations going into it. So, and again, I told you I'm going way into spoilers on this one. I was totally caught off guard when they shoot Hitler in the face with a machine gun, and they actually kill Hitler, and this whole plot to kill the Nazis and all the high command that did not happen in real life actually happens. And so watching it this second time, with that in mind, it was really interesting just kind of thinking about the way I was kind of reminded of like a Ray Bradbury quote where he talks about most of his books as not being science fiction, but science fantasy. They're things that take place in a scientific environment, but things that could never happen, like Martian colonies and stuff like that we know don't exist, but he uses that as a vehicle for telling his stories. And I feel like Tarantino does this here in Inglourious Basterds, and then again in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, even more explicitly.
And Django too, to a certain extent.
And Django to an extent, except that doesn't revolve around a specific historical event in the same way. But Inglourious Basterds definitely leans into this idea of not being historical fiction in the way that you think of like Shakespeare plays like Julius Caesar or something that revolves around an actual thing and just heightening the drama of all of the people involved. But it's historical fantasy. It's putting this story in World War II and Quentin Tarantino basically sitting down and being like, how would I end World War II? What would I do if I was in World War II, knowing that the Allies are going to win, knowing that we're going to pull this off? How would I kill Hitler? In what ways
it's that
would I
ultimate cliche? If you had a time machine,
exactly.
Everyone would go back and kill Hitler. Right?
And like if I could just kill Nazis, like would I create this posse of guys that just like enjoyed it? when you're watching real war films that have to deal with like actual historical accuracy, you feel much more of a sense of patriotism that was actually there. You know, there was so much propaganda on both sides of the war. So you feel like you're doing this for a cause, and all this kind of stuff. But once you take a step back, now being a little distance from it in history and being able to say, all right, we won World War II. We defeated this thing. It was really bad, but I'm just going to basically what Tarantino is doing is ridiculing the Nazis, and he's just making them laughing stocks in the butt of the joke all the way through the movie after the first massacre in that first scene. That again villainizes them so that we can enjoy their humiliation throughout the rest of the movie. Not to say they're not like a threat still. In scenes like the bar scene, which again
another amazing scene.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, you feel like they're getting what they deserve, and the more terrible that it is, the better. Is basically the mindset that Quentin Tarantino is trying to set up for the audience.
Yeah, and he wants. I think he's also kind of building on this whole idea of like, you know, there's like a catharsis to it.
Yeah,
too, you
that's
know,
a good way
just
to put
like
it.
Being able to, and there's also a kind of a commentary about it. Not to dive into too many points at once, but this whole idea of like, you know, there's obviously like how history played out, but Tarantino is answering this kind of this what if question, and it's like, it's interesting because in one of the articles I read, he talks about how when they presented this film to a German audience, you know, obviously the Holocaust and you know, the rise of Hitler is obviously a huge point of shame amongst German culture even to today, and it actually how the German audience responded, it kind of gave this sense of catharsis for them, being able to watch a movie where it's very much about kind of like saying, you know, Nazis are this ultimate evil, and we get to sit back and we get to watch them essentially get killed and destroyed, and in the most brutal and Tarantino style
and realizing that
way possible.
That's not who we are anymore, kind of a thing.
Yes.
That's interesting. Huh. So, okay, here's another thing that I was thinking about this film. And I know a lot of people like this movie, and this is the movie that Quentin Tarantino swears he'll be remembered for once his career is over. But I almost started to feel like that first scene, which is very like a kettle ready to boil kind of a thing. I said it a lot better in my notes, so anyone that's subscribed on Patreon can go look at that. Yeah, so this way that he structures a scene of this meeting with politeness and trying to kind of each of the characters trying to figure out basically what the other character knows or doesn't know, and once you've gotten to this point where basically you both realize that it's going to come to a head, and then who pulls the trigger first, and kind of building a scene. And again, all through dialogue, because that's what Tarantino does.
Of course.
And then it either explodes, like in the, again, in the bar scene, in the little basement bar thing, or it doesn't, like in the interview that Shoshana has with Christoph Waltz's character, which kind of dissipates. But I felt like that was almost started to get repetitive, because he does the same type of thing in 3 or 4 different scenes, and I don't know, do you have that same sense, or am I just being really nitpicky about Tarantino? I know that's almost blasphemous for some people who are like diehard Tarantino fans.
Right, so I can see where you're coming from. Maybe my advice would be just to sit back and enjoy the ride a little bit more.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously I think there are parallels, and sometimes, actually I wouldn't even say sometimes. I feel like always those mirrorings that Tarantino does are intentional, because he wants you to think Okay, so this scene is similar to the other scene. So now you have both scenes in your head.
Yeah.
Going into the next scene.
And it does kind of get amped up each time. So in the first scene, obviously Christoph Waltz has the upper hand. In the scene with the strudel, Christoph Waltz still has the upper hand, but she comes out on top because he doesn't find her out. And then in the bar scene, everyone is pretty evenly matched, which means everybody dies. And then up until the climax, and even the scene where Frederick comes into the projector room does the same kind of thing in a more compressed time span. So yeah, he kind of like ups the stakes every time that he brings that in. But I just kind of felt like, oh yeah, he kind of already did this. And of course, there's a lot of fun stuff along the way, like as historical fantasy and as this kind of like what would I do type of situation. Tarantino has a lot of fun with this, and putting Aldo in the position where he has to pretend to be an Italian. And oh my gosh, the Buongiorno line and scene is just, that's another one where Christoph Waltz also has the upper hand and kind of does this boiler thing, and then he lets it go even though he already knows all the information that he needs to, and then he does the same thing whenever he gets the actress girl in the room. So yeah, there's a lot of that, but he builds tension in a lot of different ways. And that scene at the end with the film premiere, there's a shot that follows who does it follow? I think
Shoshana?
No, because maybe it was Shoshana, because it starts on the balcony and it travels, talking about this is a really long shot again. It travels all the way down, pulls out to a wide shot of the ballroom, and then comes back down to see, I think, Christoph Waltz and the Bastards. But I want to say that is a Hitchcock callback to Notorious, I think. There's another scene that he does that's a really long tracking shot through a ballroom, from like a killer to a victim or something like that. I can't say exactly. I'd probably have to look it up. But that was just another thing. Like when you're making a movie that's full of this many scenes of suspense and tension, like there's just so much Hitchcock in there. Well, I mean, of course, Tarantino is pulling that intentionally, just being who he is. But, whether you want to or not, if you're making a film with this much suspense in it, you're going to be pulling from Hitchcock.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just like that finale is such an interesting scene because it's like, when have you ever seen like a Nazi infiltration scene that's played off as comedically?
Right.
As in endpoints as that. And it's like, obviously, all right.
If you're comparing it to something like Valkyrie, like an actual infiltration that went terribly wrong.
Yes. And the great thing about this finale scene is we finally get the conversion of our three protagonists, and we kind of get this interesting climax where we're kind of analyzing, we have this film premiere, this violent film premiere that's kind of like this gory propaganda. But at the same time, you could argue, okay, Tarantino is also, agoraphile as well. Is that a word?
It is now. I like
Yes.
it. As soon as you said it, I was like, that is the perfect description.
And he's kind of holding up a mirror to himself and the audience, and he's asking, okay, is this kind of entertainment,
Where do you draw the line?
Yeah. Are we all just Nazis watching war propaganda?
The interesting thing that I just thought of, I can't believe I didn't really put this connection together. But while we were talking about this climax scene, I realized that they're watching this movie about a guy in a high tower who literally has unlimited allies that he can shoot at for days and days. And then the film goes terribly wrong, and all of these Nazis are trapped in this room, and the two bastards are up in one of the opera boxes, and they're just shooting fish in a barrel, exactly in the way that the movie happened, but it's the Allies shooting all the Nazis, and they just are, unleashing their machine guns on them, and they're all trapped in this stadium. So I never put together that parallel that even as Tarantino is kind of making this commentary on violent films and propaganda and stuff, he then ups himself with the way that he ends the scene.
Yes, the first 3D film experience.
Yeah, with the Revenge of the Angry Face. And that's the other thing, is that this movie is broken up into chapters, and they're called chapters. So that's one of the evolutions of Tarantino films that continues through a lot of his movies. They're broken up into literal chapters, and this one is called Revenge of the Angry Face or something like that. Yes. Revenge of the Giant Face, I think.
Yes, Giant Face. That's correct.
So I guess we're running long on this podcast, but it's really good discussion. So the last thing that I do want to bring up is your thoughts on the very end and the power dynamics that go into Christoph Waltz's betrayal of the Nazis and the way that the film completely ends after the climax.
The way this film ends is, the first time I saw it, I was like completely thrown for a loop, but what Tarantino does is he does kind of build, and we're going to jump back to duality here. This whole idea of that Christoph Waltz he does evil things, but he's more of a detective than he is a Nazi. But
and he's also, you get this sense of self-preservation, which I think is a commentary on all the Nazis after the war ended, and the way that, the classic lines of, well, we were just following orders of our superiors. And
of course,
basically this is the largest historical example of passing the buck and trying to save your own skin for all the things that you've done. And so the way that the movie ends is Christoph Waltz captures the bastards, and he knows that this plan to kill Hitler is about to actually work. And he's like, I'll let your plan work if you give me all of these immunities and stuff like that. And so he becomes a turncoat, basically, in this ironic way. And then Brad Pitt has a great monologue at the end where he's like, all right, if you give me that chance, I'm going to take any chance I can to win the war. But basically the extremity of the circumstances mean that I don't have to keep my end of the bargain.
Yeah. So I think, so the final note that Tarantino chooses to end on, which I think is a very appropriate note, is kind of Christoph Waltz getting at least some justice for all the evil that he's committed, even though technically now he's won the war for the Allies. So we kind of get this great moment where Brad Pitt's character carves a swastika into his head, which is kind of a thing that he's been doing throughout the film to all of the Nazis that he's interrogated, that he's let go, that he hasn't killed.
One of the interesting things that I guess paid attention to this time is that we only see that happen 2 times. And the first time we see it from the worm's eye view of him carving the swastika. And so he saves the actual gory reveal of the swastika being cut in the forehead for this last one on Christoph Waltz. And we actually get to see all the prosthetics and the gore and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because we know what's coming, but we haven't seen it until this very, very last bit.
And I think that kind of ties back into the catharsis. I mean, we want to see the villain suffer. But
and it's a commentary on, like, this attitude of once a Nazi, always a Nazi. And like, you can't just outrun it. You can't just put on new clothes and say, I never did that, kind of a thing. Which is interesting, especially, looking back, because even over the last several years, there have been trials of 90-year-old Nazis who, and debates over, like, should they still be held responsible? Should they still be, executed and stuff like that, because of what they did 50, 60 years ago when they were 18 or something? And so Quentin Tarantino kind of gives his answer through that very last scene. And the other thing is, again, his attitude towards the film of this being what he'll be remembered for. The last line of the movie is, I think this is my masterpiece, which I feel like is as much Quentin Tarantino talking to the audience as the character actually, expressing that.
that's the one of the things we haven't really talked about in the podcast yet is Tarantino will always incorporate a wonderful meta element, kind of exploring who he is as a person. And in fact, in a lot of interviews, he'll talk about how deeply personal all of his scripts are to him. And then he just takes like all these deeply personal things that have happened to him, and he'll just bury them in genre and gore and all of these different motifs and ideas till the point where they're completely unrecognizable, which is I think is a really interesting way to tell stories.
Yeah. And I do want to get your take on some of the really quirky stylistic things that Tarantino does, because I'm a little on the fence about them just in the way that they're executed. So I'm talking specifically about the way that he uses voiceover, but only like once or twice, and the way that he'll like scribble on the screen. So when we're seeing that big ballroom scene and he's like, here's this guy in the high command and here's this person and stuff like that. But to me, sometimes those elements, like as fun as they are, they feel like inconsistent elements of the style because they don't show up until like halfway through the movie, and then they never show up again, or they're just used like when it's convenient. Like for example, and this is the way that Samuel L. Jackson shows up in Inglourious, which he shows up in almost all of his movies ever since Pulp Fiction, I think.
He was supposed to have a role in Reservoir Dogs as well.
Was he? Okay.
Yeah, but I think there was a scheduling conflict.
Oh, that's funny. But Samuel Jackson has this voiceover where he talks about how nitrate film is super flammable and stuff like that. And I don't know, I can't help myself from thinking like, would there have been a way to like add that into the scene, into the script, like in a more subtle way rather than just spilling out information to the audience?
It's an interesting question. And I definitely see where you're coming from. I think, I guess the argument to that would be because, I mean, even he didn't do it so much in Reservoir Dogs. Reservoir Dogs has a bit of a more traditional, he kind of keeps all of the...
and again, it's his first one. He's still, per se, finding his sea legs, and also just he has to kind of get his name out there before he can break all the rules of filmmaking.
Yeah. I think that might be just the best way to give that answer, is that he's a rule breaker, and your expectation going into a Tarantino film is that he's going to break the rules of film a little bit. So when he does things like this, like in Kill Bill, where there'll be like a series of action scenes, and then he'll break out into essentially a documentary style about scene about one of the characters narrated by the protagonist. I can see how, to me, it's always just been this whole idea of, and you've been talking about this a lot, of Tarantino just likes to have fun, and he likes to kind of, do things that are unconventional and interesting. So, yeah, I can see, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that Tarantino films, they don't always want you completely immersed in the film throughout the entire thing. I think there are scenes where he does a great job of like keeping you immersed from beginning to end, but then he also almost wants to give you a breather and almost remind you, hey, we're watching a movie. I think Tarantino loves to do that, especially because if you were completely immersed in some of Tarantino's stories, like definitely the violence might be way too much. Yeah. But the fact that he uses these techniques to kind of take you out for a little bit and have fun and like, oh, we're watching a movie, this is a good time. It kind of allows you to distance yourself a little bit and almost analyze the story a little more. Yeah. Like kind of an emotional reset for a second before you get... Okay, that's a good way to think about it. I haven't thought about it in that way. So, but let's move on to chapter 3 of the podcast. Jason, set it up.
The Hateful Eight from 2015. 1877, Wyoming, the dead of winter. a bounty hunter, Major Marquise Warren, hitches a ride on a passing stagecoach. The Major is an African-American veteran with a Civil War record at turns highly regarded and highly despised. Already in the coach are fellow bounty hunter John Ruth and his live bounty Daisy Domergue. Also in the coach is Lost Causer ex-Confederate soldier Chris Mannix. Ruth and Warren bond over a letter from Abraham Lincoln, while Mannix does the opposite of bonding. They arrive at Minnie's haberdashery and are greeted by Bob, a Mexican who says the owner is away visiting her mother. Also at the haberdashery are Oswaldo Mabre, a hangman, Joe Gage, a silent cowboy heading home to his mother, and Sanford Smithers, a former Confederate general. Suffice to say that something is rotten in Minnie's haberdashery, and it isn't long before the powder keg of 8 hateful strangers goes bang, bang, bang.
All right, Hayden. So this movie is interesting. So Tarantino did... Wow, the way this movie was released has been kind of a roller coaster. So we both went at separate times to see what Tarantino called the Roadshow version of this movie when it was released. So in the Roadshow version, I think there was
20 extra minutes of footage.
10 to 20 extra minutes of footage.
Featured in glorious 70 millimeter.
So he filmed it in this really, really widescreen format called 70 millimeter, which for those of you who don't know is typically reserved for... It was used a lot between like the 50s and the 70s for mostly really kind of epic scale films. So Lawrence of Arabia, Ben-Hur, 2001: A Space Odyssey, movies like that, which is important because I'm interested in the reason that this film was filmed in 70 millimeter. But he wanted to create this really epic presentation of the film in the theaters. So you would go...
Yeah. Kind of like capturing like an old school night out at the movies. There's an opening introduction, like a musical introduction. There's a music
overture,
intermission.
And an intermission.
You would get a playbill to go along with it. He really just wanted to celebrate, a time where going out to the movie theaters, you would get dressed up.
It was an occasion,
yes,
an event. So that was released. There was also a theatrical version, which again was a little bit shorter, more traditional. And then a couple months ago, it was released on Netflix. The theatrical version was released on Netflix, but also there was a extended version, which is presented in a type of mini-series format, 50-minute segments, 4 episodes, if you will. So there's been like a lot of stuff that Tarantino has done with this, just kind of reworking it and stuff like that. But before we get into all that, I just want to know why you like this film.
The wonderful thing about this film is it really is kind of getting back to Reservoir Dogs. It's presented almost like a stage play, as in we get this one single location, Minnie's haberdashery, which is the focal point of the entire film. I mean, there are other locations as well, but it really is presented kind of in this very theater esque.
I definitely agree with that. Watching it this time, I felt like this is the most theatrical of his movies. I could totally see this being done on a stage.
Right. So they get caught up in this blizzard in Minnie's haberdashery, and we're basically dealing with all of these very questionable characters who we understand are almost no one is who they say they are. And we kind of get to see them interact, and we get to explore a lot of the post-Civil War conflicts that occurred amongst definitely the North and the South. And Tarantino has a lot of fun kind of like dividing up Minnie's haberdashery into the 2 different sides. And really, it's just another wonderful character exploration done in the form of another period piece.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that, like, for all the crudeness of Tarantino films, he does a lot for breaking down these racial barriers and stuff like that, and kind of like, again, putting this kind of ridiculous side to racism and sexism and stuff like that, like in the way that he does with Django Unchained is probably the most extreme example of his. It's basically his Inglourious Basterds for, like
Southern
slavery.
races.
Yeah.
Yes.
American racism and stuff like that.
Kind of the United States, kind of how we were talking about earlier, how, the Holocaust was the ultimate like shame for the Germans. I think slavery is that it's the exact same thing for the United States. So it's kind of like, it's interesting. We haven't really talked too much about how Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained kind of mirror each other. And I think Hateful Eight also kind of continues that conversation, but also at the same time is a callback to his original film as well.
Yeah, with, like you said, Reservoir Dogs, because they're both these really kind of bottle movies that take place in mostly one area where they're more or less trapped. This time around, actually watching The Hateful Eight, I got this really Agatha Christie vibe, like almost And Then There Were None, dark and stormy night, all these people trapped in a castle, or in this case, a little cottage, and at first you're trying to figure out, they're all thrown there for whatever reason. They have various relationships to each other, differing in status and whether they know each other, their past and their prejudices, all that kind of stuff. And then a murder happens. And then basically Samuel L. Jackson's character, who becomes the main character throughout the story, kind of turns into like a Hercule Poirot kind of a character where he's breaking down like, all right, I know you didn't do it. I don't know that much about you, but what I know about this situation. And so he's like breaking down, here's what happened kind of a deal, just in a much more violent kind of situation than Agatha Christie ever did. But
Tarantino loves to not show us what happened and then have the characters try to figure out what happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another callback to Reservoir Dogs.
So yeah, and the cast is great, and the characters are so vibrant and distinct that I think that's another thing that makes it feel very theatrical to me, is just how over the top all of the characters were, and the way that they interacted and all of that.
Yeah, we have like in The Hateful Eight, we have all of Tarantino's like really major players in there. Obviously Samuel L. Jackson, but Kurt Russell, who's been in a lot of his stuff, Tim Roth,
Yeah,
Michael Madsen. Like those are like the Tarantino quintessential actors. I think maybe Uma Thurman. If Uma Thurman had been in it,
right? If she was the criminal or something.
Yes, but Uma Thurman's stunt double is in it.
Oh, really?
Zoe Bell. She plays.
Was she the Australian girl?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And she's in a lot of Tarantino
New Zealand.
stuff.
She was Kiwi.
Now too, but she was a stunt person originally.
I'm always surprised at how many times like Aussies and Kiwis show up in Tarantino movies. It seems so random. Like in Django, for a bunch of Aussies to be driving slaves to a coal mine or something.
Yes.
But
now,
it's
I
kind
think
of
the story behind that was Tarantino couldn't do a Southern accent.
Oh, really?
So that's why they made them
I can do an
Australian.
Australian accent. Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, and again, like we said, this has a Ennio Morricone score, which is perfect for a Western. And the more I watch Tarantino, the more I realize like how much of a Western aficionado he is. Because obviously Django and The Hateful Eight are like direct calls to Westerns. But Kill Bill has a lot of Western influence to it. Even...
Definitely Kill Bill 2.
Yeah,
or
Kill Bill 2.
Half.
I mean, a lot of Kill Bill kind of is just genre hopping, but even the samurai stuff is pulling from samurai films that pulled from Western films to begin with. So it's like this whole cycle. And even Inglourious Basterds has a little bit of a Western thing, with the bastards being kind of these renegades and that whole deal. So, and then even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has a little bit of those draws in it. So
there's a whole thing. I mean,
yeah,
with the main character being a Western
actor, and then the Western set and all that. So
more Tarantino meta fun.
There's just I didn't realize like how much Western influence goes into all of his movies. I typically think of him as kind of all over the place, but there's so much Western. And for a guy who's named after the main character of Gunsmoke, what do you expect?
His parents knew what they were doing.
Okay, so the other thing is, like I was alluding to, this is a really, really contained movie, and yet it's shot on this really big format, which is, you typically used for showing the vastness of space or the Arabian desert and all this kind of stuff. So what are your thoughts on like the ways that it's used in this tiny little cabin? And the compositions and stuff are really great, but I don't know. I can't decide if it just feels excessive to me.
I guess the argument that I would have for that would be this is a film about uncertainty and backstabbers, so always having kind of a few of the characters blurred out in the background. You were talking about that technique that Tarantino uses. Yeah. Uses a tremendous amount in this film. Having that sense of like there's always someone doing something in the background, even when the primary action is going on. And I mean, that's actually the main driving plot, one of the main driving plot points of the film is what's happening in the background. So I think the choice for the 70 millimeter allows us to get a much wider spectrum of what's going on. And it's interesting though, that it is the choice to do that in kind of a contained area is something that isn't done often, but I think is very interesting. Yeah. And of course, when they are out in the blizzard, it gives you some
at the very beginning
shots.
Yeah, when they're driving up and that really long shot from the crucifix to the stagecoach coming in is gorgeous. And you're right, kind of like, I guess if you're reading a whodunit, you kind of have this bigger scope to, I guess, your imagination, just because you have an omniscient narrator, usually, maybe sometimes somewhat limited. But I guess you're right, that wider scope kind of gives you at least the feeling that if you were paying attention, you'd be able to piece together this mystery, if we're going to keep with my little mystery thing that I'm trying to shove in here.
No, this is definitely a mystery film, at least to the first 3/4 of it.
I think the setup is still like the setup of a whodunit, and then there's a murder, and then it becomes a literal detective story, and then it all comes out and it turns into more of like a really tense kind of power play shootout kind of deal.
Western.
Right. Western in a barn, basically.
Yes.
I don't know how many times you've watched this. I've only seen it the once during the road show and then rewatching it again for this podcast. But was there any kind of like difference in impression when you rewatched it?
Yeah, actually, the interesting thing is this might be the film that I go back and watch the most. Funnily enough, I guess I do just like the setup and how it is that kind of whodunit, self-contained,
a little bit of slow burn too.
Yeah, I mean, they take a lot of time to explore the characters. There's so many scenes that don't necessarily need to be in the picture, but it's like it's there to give you a kind of a sense of the universe and how the characters interact in the universe. Right, the one I think of is when they're kind of having that weird dance to the outhouse, which I guess you could argue is important for the later scenes. There's just this character in the film that just gets picked on relentlessly by fate and by everyone else, and he constantly has to go out in the blizzard. He's the driver.
Oh, OB, yeah.
OB. Yeah, OB just does not get a break in this film.
Yeah, he's
the only one who seems like a genuinely nice guy.
Yeah, that's true. Like he's kind of just there until he becomes a red shirt, basically. Spoilers. Yeah. But again, I'm going to put down a spoiler warning here too, because as a mystery, we're going to have to kind of go through the whole deal. The other Tarantino regular that's in this is Bruce Dern. He was kind of just this crotchety old man who kind of had a part to play, but he was almost like a MacGuffin in himself. He was just kind of a distraction from the actual plot that was going on. And he's kind of like the the unfaithful person in this whodunit who accidentally happens to have this relationship with Sammy Jackson's character that he didn't intend to run into him here, but it just turned out to be a really bad situation for him.
And that also kind of gives another layer to Walton Goggins' character, Chris Mannix, who is part of this basically Southern renegade who violently went and killed all these black villages. And it's interesting because towards the end, it's like this character is played off as like this extremely racist, the typical Southern hillbilly.
Yeah.
And then the relationship that he and Sam Jackson's character form at the end is...
I mean, that's the real story of the movie, right?
Yeah, it's
bringing those two characters together.
It's strangely sweet.
Yeah.
But it's like both of these characters have essentially like hated, or like they're like almost the embodiments of the North and the South. Kind of. And they've both killed a lot of people on the other side. And
enjoyed it.
And yes.
I mean, they're kind of the same kind of deal that Tarantino is working with the Bastards and with Django is they're two different sides of this maniacal enjoyment of feeling justified in murder to some extent or another in a war context. They're on both sides of that, where one of them just, felt that they were safe and protected in killing African Americans, and the other one felt they were safe and protected in killing Southern slave owners and stuff like that. And so they did a lot of that, and then they have to come to this point of reconciliation by the end, which is ultimately the real, like I said, the real emotional arc of the film. I feel like with all the other stuff kind of thrown in there. Well, on a slightly different topic, this is something that I was just kind of scanning through the Wikipedia article, and of all the things, like Tarantino is a very controversial director. From his presentation of race, his use of the N-word, just like as one example of all of his
of course,
language and stuff like that. That one really sticks out to people, especially when he's dealing with this Civil War era America setting. But the other thing that in this film is the only female character is, first of all, a criminal. Second of all, she's constantly getting beat up and derided by Kurt Russell's character. And then, again, spoilers, ultimately kind of hung. And a lot of people didn't... There's kind of a debate on both sides of like how this is as far as representing women. One, that this is just kind of justified misogyny on the part of Quentin Tarantino. And the other one is that it's not, because Daisy Domergue is a criminal and she's not treated differently than any other criminal, male or female, and she gets what she deserves by the end in a classic Western justice kind of thing. And this is even a conversation that happens in the film. Like,
yeah. So you don't have a problem with bringing a woman to the rope, right? Yeah.
So not something that I really have strong feelings about one way or another while watching the film, but it's interesting. There are these kind of controversies that get brought up on Tarantino films, but I think he does a good job of showing kind of a nuanced enough aspect to all of them that you can make arguments on either way. Like same thing with his use of racist language or his presentation of race in Django and stuff like that.
Well, I think, yes, these things are controversial, but if they're starting conversations, then that's something that an artist can't be afraid of bringing up, because I think it's important.
I don't think Tarantino's afraid of putting any of this in his movies.
I think that's something we can learn from Tarantino is the importance of starting these discussions, and maybe not in every case is he the right person to start the discussion. But at least the discussion is being had in some extent. And I don't necessarily agree with all the things that he does in all of his movies, but I do admire his fearlessness and conviction in, he believes that in doing them, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things about this movie. And I did read at least one interview about this movie. This is kind of one of the seediest movies that he's made, if you will. All the characters have really dark sides to them. There is not like maybe OB or Minnie
OB.
or someone who like doesn't show up for more than 5 minutes are the most sympathetic characters, but all the I mean, it's literally called the Hateful Eight, and the 8 characters that we're following are all truly hateful in one way or another. And we sort of build sympathy for Samuel L. Jackson's character and the other Southern guy, but
Chris Mannix,
the sheriff guy, Mannix.
Probably just because he's an idiot.
Right. But overall, there's not a lot of likable characters. And Tarantino knew that he calls this a quote unquote ugly film. I mean, it's really got a lot of ugliness to it. But I think that he uses that to, like you said, start conversations or just kind of use it as an outlet for maybe things that he's personally kind of worked through in his own philosophies of these types of things. And I don't think that he makes a lot of comment on his views of this stuff outside of his movies, but he presents his movies out there as, I feel like a lot of times, internal conversations that he has with himself. And again, like you said, he often talks about the fact that all of his movies present a lot of really personal stuff for him, but he couches it in all of these things that, he's able to be vulnerable in a safe way, if that makes sense. It's kind of like the director's privilege, and especially for a writer-director like Quentin Tarantino, because we didn't say this at the top, but Quentin Tarantino writes and directs every one of his movies. He doesn't do adaptations of anything.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
So yeah, I guess we could touch on the idea of releasing the extended cut, which neither of us watched. We wanted to really focus on the theatrical movie version of the film. But what are your thoughts on just the fact that Tarantino did release a 4-episode extended miniseries of the film on Netflix?
To be honest, it actually surprised me a little bit, because he's always been kind of an advocate against kind of
He's a purist.
He's an absolute, film purist. So the fact that he kind of made this deal with Netflix when he has always been vocal about disliking kind of the Netflix generation, where we just kind of sit down and we consume media at such a quick and laissez-faire kind of way.
And especially with this film that was given the roadshow release to celebrate the theatrical experience, to then kind of make it this episodical thing that you can pick up and put down, is really interesting. Like, to do it in general, but like to do it with Kill Bill is different than to do it with the Hateful Eight,
Yeah, and I'm still looking for the release of Kill Bill where it's the entire film as one entire conglomeration, and it has an extra like 10 minutes to it. It's usually shown at Tarantino's private theater. It's called The Whole Bloody Affair.
I thought that was the name of the 3rd volume that he's working on.
No. That's the name of the combination of the first and second films.
Interesting.
They had to divide it up because it would have been a 4.5-hour film.
Yeah.
But I would love to. I haven't actually seen the two meshed together, and I would love to.
Yeah.
Get a chance to see that.
So I'll post a link to the article that I read that was like an interview with Tarantino about the release, but he was involved. It wasn't like Netflix just took the movie and chopped it up and put it in a new format. But he sat down and kind of re-edited it. He changed a couple things, like when they do the flashback of them coming in and taking over the haberdashery, it extends a little bit longer so that we see the whole first scene of them entering the haberdashery again, but from the villain's point of view kind of thing, like them knowing, like now that we know what all's going on. So I don't know, it's just interesting. All right, well, anything else to say about the Hateful Eight, Hayden?
No.
So yeah, let's just move on into overall notes and talk about Quentin Tarantino as a director. Is Tarantino your favorite film director? I haven't asked you this specifically.
No, but he's up there.
Yeah. So what makes him? I kind of asked you this at the beginning, but what are the things that make Tarantino in your mind? That if they weren't there, it wouldn't be a Tarantino movie.
I think the biggest thing is an emphasis on character and style and how these characters are presented in unique ways that are surprising and interesting, and kind of going back to what we were talking a little bit with the Hateful Eight, kind of a fearlessness to really dive into his psyche and topics that a lot of directors kind of shy away from. And then again, also, we've kind of discussed this a little bit. His playfulness is another big thing, how he'll take a scene that, 9 out of 10 directors would treat the material with, as something that's absolute, like the Holocaust,
Yeah.
with absolute seriousness, and he'll find a way to have it presented in a completely different way, like more joking or more, emotional, or I guess emotional is something that's done a lot, but he finds ways to present ideas and topics in interesting new ways, which I think is always a valuable thing that we can do as storytellers and people.
Yeah, it's something interesting that I hadn't thought of too much, but I saw someone post on Twitter kind of regarding Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. They said that basically Tarantino, most of his movies are done kind of tongue-in-cheek with a wink to the audience. Like you said, he's not afraid of putting in those elements that make you remember that you're watching a movie. And he covers really intense and serious topics with somewhat of a lightheartedness, even though that lightheartedness comes with a lot of violence and language and stuff like that. It's like it's kind of his playground, though. Even with all that, it's where he can take a situation and just go nuts with it. And he still puts a lot of depth into it, but it never feels like he's being too serious with the material. It always feels like, he's kind of winking at the audience throughout the whole thing, to some extent or another. I think that makes him, that's a pretty unique thing for him as a director to have carried across his entire career.
And part of that kind of dives into the whole human disillusionment that's happened through Hollywood over the past, 100 years. It's like we're so the news and all these different things on social media has so overexposed us to all of these different like tragedies and events, and it's almost like that overexposure almost is creating like this disconnect in the next generation. So yeah, it's an interesting topic to dive into for sure. But yeah, that's why, in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he's totally sentimental and just talks about the 60s.
Yeah.
But,
and he's got this fantasy element that runs through all of his movies too, like we already talked about again, where even in Inglourious, it's obviously this kind of fantastical portrayal of World War II, but even in Django, it's almost this Southern fantasy of, the ex-slave who gets to go around and kill slaveholders and stuff like that. And then he does it again in Once Upon a Time. So he's always got this, like, whatever period he's working in, he can put on this kind of like, he's never too restricted by historical accuracy. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Is like he's got a situation, he's got something to put it in, but he doesn't put limitations on himself in almost any respect. He just has like good taste in where to keep his limits, but it never feels like he's actually confined by something other than his own artistic taste.
That's a good way to put it. Yes, I totally agree. Like he's so much in love with films and films from all different genres and is such a cinephile. Like, you can see like 100 different films referenced in each of his movies, and like we kind of talk about this a lot, where it's you have that contrast between kind of, you know, the deeply interpersonal, like human connections that he's making versus like these fantastical fantasy concepts that he's pulled from almost this escapism that he kind of tries to put in all of his films. Like, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Is like, you know, it's like dealing with both these tremendously harsh realities, but also he always calls back to the wonderful magic that is cinema and how it really can help us deal with and, you know, for a moment in time, escape from kind of the horrors that we have to deal with in society on a daily basis.
Yeah. And so aside from Tarantino's own kind of cameos that he puts in his movies, I didn't actually know this beforehand, but tell me a little bit about the whole red apple Easter egg thing that he puts in his movies.
Oh yeah, I mean there are an absolute ton of Tarantino references that could kind of connect the films together. I think one of the big ones is that he was actually planning on making a movie about was the characters that are played by Michael Madsen in Reservoir Dogs and then Vic Vega in Pulp Fiction. They're actually supposed to be brothers.
Oh,
but also, obviously the big one that kind of carries throughout is he'll have references to Red Apple cigarettes. I think the first time they referenced that was in Pulp Fiction. So Vincent Vega's character, after that, he and Samuel L. Jackson's character have pulled off a job. I'm using half character names and half character.
We do that on the podcast all the time. You're good.
After they've pulled off their job for Marcellus, they go into the bar, which is kind of like their, I guess, also kind of doubles as their meeting place. And he asks for Red Apple cigarettes, and then that continues. It just makes appearances throughout all of Tarantino's films. Like it's also the cigarette that they smoke in Hateful Eight and in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's actually a commercial done by Leonardo DiCaprio. Yeah, it's pretty funny. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole. You can go online and there's like theories about that connect all of the Tarantino films together into
Tarantino cinematic universe.
It's a real thing, and
that's hilarious because there's so many period pieces mixed in with that.
Yes,
seems like it would be difficult.
No, but I mean they even accommodate for the period pieces.
People will do it. Yeah. All right. Well, any other kind of general things that you want to talk about Tarantino before we wrap this episode up, Hayden?
No.
All right. Well, then let me kind of get through our housekeeping stuff. Next time on the podcast, Alex will be returning, and we're going to talk about swashbuckling films throughout film history, starting with the Errol Flynn film The Adventures of Robin Hood from 1938, and then we're going to bring it to the space age in The Empire Strikes Back from 1980, kind of a twist on the swashbuckling genre, and then the modern state of swashbuckling, and one of the films that I connected with really early on in my love of film, which is Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl from 2003. So I'm excited to talk about all those. That should be pretty fun. And then over on our, if you'd like to support the show, you can donate to us on Patreon or Coffee. And again, if you donate at all, you will get the complete set of extended edition Lord of the Rings commentary tracks. And then on the bonus podcast tier of the Patreon for $5 a month, our latest podcast that you can listen to right now covers Male and Female from 1919, a Cecil B. DeMille film from 100 years ago. And the upcoming episode will be Hayden and I talking about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to continue this discussion. And Hayden, do you have any plugs that you would like to make?
Yes. So you can find me on a YouTube channel called Now with Milk. We do comedy shorts. Just on YouTube, type in Now with Milk, and you can check us out. We have some very interesting comedy bits, and we have a lot of stuff in the works that we're very excited about. So just, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Jonathan. I had a blast as always. I got to do one with Alex. I got to do one with both of you. And now I've gotten to do my one with you. So I've checked off all of my coupons.
You are the official host replacement for the Filmlings. But that's about all the time we have for this episode. If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel, and Alex is at Alex Geringer. What are you, Hayden?
I am at Hayden Chauffe.
And I'm at the Blue Jay, 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlinks.com. If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about. We definitely appreciate it. Hayden, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure talking to you about Tarantino.
Yes.
There was so much to cover.
Oh my gosh.
But I think we did it. There will always be something else, but I really appreciate your insight.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye-bye now.
Anything you want to badmouth about Alex while I'm recording before we start?
Boy, that Alex, what a rascal.
What a rascal. That's the worst you could come up with, Hayden. You're too nice. All right.